Hello, my name is Charles Goldfarb, and I'm joined by my co-host Alexander Aleem for the AOA podcast Lessons in Orthopedic Leadership. I am pleased to share that our listenership continues to grow, and we will continue to tackle topics of interest to all leaders, but especially those in orthopedic surgery. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and leave a review when you have a chance. We are lucky to have a special guest this episode, and I'd like to do a proper introduction for John Eklund, who is going to speak about incorporating innovation into your organizational structure. Before I introduce him, I will share that we are lucky enough to have John on the program through the AOA Apex Leadership Program, which leverages the expertise at USC Business School, the USC Marshall School, and that's our connection to John, but you guys are going to really enjoy our conversation. John is an assistant professor at USC's Marshall School in the Management and Organization Department. He has his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, his MBA from the University of Notre Dame, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University. Prior to his PhD at the Wharton School, John was a management consultant with A.T. Kearney in Chicago. There he worked on various operational consulting projects and even did a project with the National Health Service in the UK looking at sourcing of drugs and materials at lower cost. He worked in Australia with Booz & Company on several projects, including some work on health insurance pricing, higher education, amongst others. And his research lies at the intersection of strategy and innovation, with an emphasis on how firms' organizational designs can shape their performance outcomes. These outcomes can relate to firms' innovation efforts, as well as their broader performance. In examining this phenomenon, John studies the underlying mechanisms, such as incentives, knowledge flows, and the breadth of strategies that firms pursue to shape organizational design choices and their consequences. So, John, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I look forward to your questions.
This is it's an honor, and I think Chuck kind of highlighted this is one of the many advantages that we have with our connection with USC through the Apex program. I am currently 3/4 of the way through my Apex, and it's been amazing. And I think it's topics like this that get you kind of thinking, and stuff that you don't think about in your medical training, but then has such a real life kind of applicability to it. I guess let's start really basic. And your research is an organizational structure. Maybe kind of talk about different sort of stereotypes or really basic kind of structures that you see in corporations or within sort of systems, and kind of give our listeners just kind of a little bit of a basic overview of what those structures may be.
Yeah, happy to do so. First of all, as I said, I'm pleased to be here, and I've got a lot of respect for the medical profession. I always wanted to be a doctor at a young age, but I just can't stand the sight of blood. So looking at organizations is probably a bit less painful. So when it comes to let's talk about organizational design. I think there's really three components associated. The first of which is organizational structure. That's the boxes and lines that we associate with company structures. You've got a CEO and you've got a top management team reporting to them. Underneath that, you've got vice presidents, etc. The second component of organizational design beyond the structure is also how decisions are made within the organization. So are those decisions translated all the way down to the front lines? They have a lot of autonomy, or do you have to keep pushing up decisions to higher levels in the organization so that it's eventually just the CEO that's making all the shots? And then finally, you've got a whole bunch of different management practices as well, which is tied into organizational design, such as what are the incentives in the organization? How are people rewarded? How's information collated and stored? So, organization design focuses on those three issues. Sort of with organizational structure, you can think of four basic sort of structure stereotypes. The first of which is what we call a simple organizational structure. And that's what a lot of startups generally start off having. There's no defined roles and responsibilities. Everybody chips in when it's required. The problem is with that sort of structure is you get above a certain size and then coordination gets really difficult. It's unclear who's responsible for what. And generally the first structure that then emerges beyond the simple structure is the functional structure. And what I mean by a functional structure is you generally divide up the organization along specific expertise lines, so finance, marketing, etc. And then as the organization gets even larger and larger and diversifies into a range of different businesses, we then get the divisional structure. So you can't, it doesn't make really a lot of sense if you've got, a diversified organization with, say, vehicles and say software, that they're all in the same part of the organization and you have very specific product lines. It's best to divide them up into divisions. And it's also easier for you to evaluate who's driving the success in an organization. And then finally, the most complicated structure is the matrix organization, where you have effectively two reporting lines, where you report up on functional lines and in divisional lines. So for example, in a healthcare context, you might be in the cardiology unit of specific geography. So you've got potentially reporting up to the head cardiologist, but you might also be reporting into the head of the California division of that organization. And those sorts of organizations, the matrix ones, get really, really tricky because it's unclear sometimes as to who's reporting to whom and who has the power. And companies like Procter & Gamble have really struggled with those sorts of structures and look to simplify their organization back to one of the functional or divisional structures.
That is fantastic. And I think all of our wheels are spinning. Before, and I don't know about Alexander, but there's so much in our own organization that I would love to have you break down. But before we get there, I think it might be interesting to talk about you shared with us an article about self-disruption as assessed through energy companies, and how that relates to structure and organization. So can you briefly talk about that? And I know it's a big topic, but it's super interesting. And I want to follow that up with kind of how that may relate to healthcare.
Yeah, sure. So that piece of work followed on from a research project I did during my PhD. And it was largely influenced by my role as a management consultant. So back in my management consulting days, I did a ton of projects for different utilities, for example, Origin Energy in Australia. And that industry, electric utilities, people think of it as a rather staid industry. Nobody really thinks about the electricity that comes through their plugs. But it's actually going through a radical transformation at the moment, in that the old centralized model of electricity generation, where you've got a centralized power station transmitting and distributing electricity through power lines, and then eventually, the electricity gets distributed to end homes through retailers. Is being disrupted by a model where you've got effectively rooftop solar panels on somebody's home and a battery, and you don't need to get the power from the grid. And the problem is for these big utilities is they've got these huge fixed cost assets which are tied up. Big coal-fired power stations, if nobody's buying electricity off the grid or buying less electricity from the grid, those resources become much less valuable. And what we're looking at in this paper is the real struggle that incumbent firms, existing firms have when it comes to responding to such business model or technological changes. Because on the one hand, you've got a big incentive that maybe the market is moving in a direction. You're not certain though. It's uncertain at this early stage whether this is going to become the dominant model. But on the other hand, you've got a bunch of inertial forces within the organization that are holding you back. So people, managers might be incentivized for the status quo. And I found this myself dealing with these utilities, that people who are in charge of the generation units of these organizations just wanted to kill this distributed model. They didn't want these companies to be selling, sort of rooftop solar cell installations. And what we look at in this paper is effectively how these firms can overcome these internal barriers. And it really comes from understanding two things. One is, how competitive is your external market? And then secondly, your existing resources, how tied are they to the way of doing things currently? And the best situation you can be in is if you're not in a very competitive market and your resources are pretty fungible, they don't tie to the existing way of doing things. But that's, a small proportion of firms. And what you're trying to do is actually overcome these barriers through a range of different strategies. So if you've got assets which are strongly tied to the existing model, usually the best sort of strategy is to partner with somebody who's got those capabilities. And if you're in those highly competitive markets, maybe the best strategy for you is to look at certain niche segments where you're not sort of cannibalizing your existing business. But it really is a challenge for these organizations, and they're really trying to grapple with this in a range of different ways.
I think it's so fascinating. And, we see a lot of this in healthcare, trying to the kind of care models that are being changed. I think one of the struggles that a lot of us in orthopedics are struggling with is value-based healthcare versus traditional kind of compensation models. And I think to that point, a lot of us are now working in really big healthcare systems. As there's not much, small little kind of 1 and 2 doctor healthcare systems anymore. We have these big healthcare systems, and they're kind of in that same thing. And they've had a traditional way of being paid based on, just kind of money in, money out, but not looking at other things, maybe more creatively, like value-based care. I know you're starting to peel a little bit into healthcare research with your organizational research. How do you see this potentially applying into healthcare as we are running into challenges trying to convince our hospital systems to look at some of these things a little bit more creatively, especially given the last couple of years with the pandemic?
No, it's an interesting problem. Yeah, as you highlighted, I'm starting to do some research into the healthcare sector, looking at pricing. Now that hospitals have to make a lot of their pricing transparent, I think each hospital has to provide 300 different CPT codes for their most common procedures. There's an issue here, especially when it comes to, this value-based pricing, which you're talking about, that on the one hand, I think one of the challenges is that the whole incentive structure, the way hospitals operate at the moment, is based around, you've got this certain CPT code, and a person comes in for a procedure, and there's a combination of CPT codes based on their insurer. That's what they pay. And, there's no real accountability there for outcomes. It's all based on the inputs there. And I think the real challenge is translating the way in which people are incentivized based on outcomes rather than the inputs. And when it comes to structure there, this is where having these large sort of like healthcare provision systems can be quite challenging, because people can get lost in that particular system, and it's very difficult to sort of like work out who's responsible for what and who should be should be receiving the benefits of different incentives. But there is good reason for why these healthcare systems have been created, because you get huge economies of scale. And for example, like with the healthcare system example that I worked on in the UK for A.T. Kearney, the National Health Service had the real benefit there. That it's one centralized healthcare system. They can negotiate with these drugs providers and get really good deals. Whereas if you're really fragmented, you don't get those economies of scale. So you see this real challenge that you're facing is that, the larger these systems become more centralized, you've got these economies of scale. But on the other hand, it's difficult to account for who's responsible for what, and also be more agile in terms of responding to change for these value-based systems. So it's a difficult balance to achieve.
It is, and I love that response. And I would say that we watch this. On the one hand, I think most providers who believe in the care we provide love the idea of value-based care, but we're not sure how to make it financially viable. And the healthcare system, now there are certainly some that have bought in, but healthcare systems, are thriving, many of them, if the status quo. And so changing that is, it just seems like it's a big uphill climb.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. A lot of organizations have found the same sort of challenge around trying to develop around, I think it's really worth highlighting the difference around, technologies versus business models. A lot of the time that companies struggle is not so much about the technology. They've got the capability in-house and the knowledge. It's about the change in the business model. And this is, strikes me as a similar sort of situation here, is the business model is very different. We think of business models as consisting of 3 things. One is the customer value proposition, one is the profit model, and the other one is the supporting resources. And you're changing a couple of the things here. The customer value proposition is completely different. And also your profit and loss model changes. So it makes it super difficult for these organizations to adapt if you're changing 2 elements of the business model.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to pivot a little bit simply because I have a personal interest in, and I think you could spend days analyzing Washington University orthopedics. So we have recently, I think most departments and most private practices go through the same struggle. If you start small and grow, your leadership model, your organizational structure has to change. And yet that's not easy. And so Washington University was essentially run by our chairman almost single-handedly with a business partner for many, many years. But as we developed from a 10-person group to nearly 100 providers now, there has had to be change. And initially it was awkward. We sort of changed incrementally, and only recently did we really apply structure with divisions, so division of hand surgery or shoulder and elbow surgery, and vice chair positions that have very specific roles. So any thoughts on growth of organizations? And you mentioned it earlier, changes that are almost required with growth, just any thoughts around or additional thoughts around that topic?
Yeah, growth is always very challenging for organizations. Certainly it's an interesting in the management structure. You see a lot of, in the management research domain, you see a lot of work focusing on entrepreneurial companies, a lot of work focusing on sort of large established firms, but that glide path between the two is a little bit of a black box. And part of the reason for that is that, as you said, a lot of the work around focusing around small organizations highlights around the important role of founders. And the founder plays such an influential role. And depending on, the founder themselves, and this is where we get a lot of heterogeneity, how much of, say, a control freak they are, that they might be less willing to hand over more decisions as the organization grows. And that's when you get real pain points, because then everything's stuck at the founder. You can't make decisions quickly. Whereas, when you can delegate those decisions and there's more better division of responsibilities, that's when you can start to get that acceleration in growth, because, everything gets stuck in one place. I think the other challenge is whether you go functional or divisional. It sounds like in your case, you've gone divisional. There's pros and cons around the two. The functional is that you get these scale benefits that all the people of a particular function can share knowledge and you get best practices, but it's unclear. There's less of an accountability. So, for example, if your hospital's not doing well and it's all based along specific functional lines, it might be unclear as to what's driving the performance. Whereas at least with a divisional structure, okay, it's the shoulder folks, they're not doing very well at the moment, whereas the feet folks are doing brilliantly. Much more easy accountability, but the feet and the shoulder folks might end up in silos, not talking to each other, and you lose those benefits.
It's interesting because I think, to Chuck's point, we've seen this kind of grow and evolve, and I think there was kind of we almost had to force it, and then you start hearing these people kind of talk about, well, too much growth is a bad thing. We're getting too big, we're losing the things that made us what we are. But clearly that also counters with, we need to grow. We're essentially a business. We have to be able to serve our patients and also kind of stay financially viable. So how do you tackle that? Because it sounds like that may be kind of back to the original, when it's a small company and the founder really is kind of driving everything. And now you're trying to give more of that power to other people. That's obviously a struggle for people, but then where does it become too much? And maybe some sort of easy pitfalls that you've seen when you're making that transition, because obviously there's pros and cons to all the different structures and there's not one right answer, but pitfalls that you see when people are making those changes either to a divisional or functional model, that then kind of stifle the growth or maybe revert back to kind of how the way things were.
Well, first of all, you're talking to a business school professor, so too much growth is an anathema to me.
Exactly.
Lots and lots of growth is great. But I get your point. There's good growth and bad growth, as we say. But when it comes to growing and some of the pitfalls, I think is that one of the big things is that with growth comes the requirement for more sort of process that needs to be documented. I think that's really important, because you don't want to have sort of like ad hoc ways of doing things across the organization. A, it's inefficient, and B, certainly in terms of customer experience, it can give very different experiences to end customers. So I think it's important that you take advantage of sort of like trying to codify your processes. And this is where technology really helps. The effective use of technology can help you grow more effectively through codifying those processes and trying to take a lot of the sort of busy work away from, the main drivers of value in your business. I think, another thing is when you're thinking about growth is also the distribution of the growth. Quite a big problem a lot of organizations face with growth is they end up with huge portfolios of offerings where 90% of their revenues come from a very small proportion of their portfolio. And the other 10% of their revenues is a really hugely diverse range of products and services, which are difficult to manage. And you start to think about, well, what's the value of having this very diverse portfolio where a lot of things in the tail hardly, selling or offering? We may as well stop those and put more of our effort to growing the core business. So that is a balance around, having a portfolio that you can manage effectively and having a diverse enough portfolio that you're meeting all of your needs and, your customers are happy. That's always a tricky thing. But generally what I found, this is more from my consulting work, is that companies end up with, they don't play the 80-20 rule. There's this huge tail of things which aren't adding much value that should be eliminated and put the resources on the core.
Yeah, it's so interesting. In our department is become a large one, and we of course have to be committed as an academic department to providing the broad range of healthcare services to all payers and all patients in different groups, and that's really important to who we are, to our values. But we now have a divisional financial report which we really understand, and certain divisions are not moneymakers and other divisions really are. And most of us went into medicine to take care of patients, but the financial side, even in academics where it was sort of minimized for many years, is obviously super important. One question, which may be a little outside of your specific expertise, but I am curious. One of the things we are struggling with is how the importance of transparency and honest communication of honest, data and finances. And, it feels like as we grow, and maybe it's a generational factor where the younger generation really wants to talk about things. How do you think about salary transparency and those kind of things within the organizational structure?
No, it's an interesting point. Yeah. I just want to, before I go into that point, you raised something really interesting at the beginning of the conversation around, you've got all these different services and things, and I feel your pain just looking at this hospital pricing data, 259 gigabytes of pricing. You've got the CPT, you've got the insurance provider, inpatient, outpatient. My head's exploding literally with the complexity of the pricing and something I'm learning there. But just going back to your point, you're in a university institution. This is where, when you're thinking about, some divisions making money and others not making money, is what's your objective? If it's a profit-making entity, you should be quite hard-nosed, and you should be looking at either getting rid of those divisions that aren't making money or selling them off or incorporate, or trying to make them improve. It's very different when your objective is some other objective like a university. And like when I was working with universities in Australia, maybe I shouldn't say this, but the only money-making school was a business school. Engineering, humanities, and what was the third one? There was a fourth school in one of the universities I worked with, all lost money. And then technically they should just focus on business, but we can't have a bunch of universities where all they do is business. So it really depends on your objective. But when it comes to transparency, and this is where another facet of design, organizational design, that I really didn't touch on, but I think is very important, is organizational culture. And organizational culture will play a big role as to, the role of transparency. Some organizations were notoriously untransparent. You look at, for example, Enron, there was all sorts of lack of transparency there around, how they were doing their deals. Theranos as well had a culture of secrecy and things like that. And you know what happened to Theranos in the audience here, well, I'm sure will know. So, that cultural aspect is really important. And where culture comes from is, there's a bunch of behaviors and there's a bunch of, what people understand. And you need to have the behaviors where everybody is happy to share, the transparency around salaries. And I think in a university setting, that's not such an issue because, at least state-based universities in the US, that's all transparent. So, I can go onto the University of California website and see everybody's salary there. So at least you've got a starting point there, that this isn't completely alien. And you're thinking also around the incentives for individuals there. There is a real benefit around having salary transparency because A, helps people with the negotiations, and B, people know where they sit. So I think it's really important that, there is this air of transparency, but it's not just salaries, it's also transparency around how management that makes decisions. Because you end up with this sort of disjoint. You might be transparent, everybody knows each other's salaries, but it's unclear how decisions are made in the organization. Then eventually people don't trust each other, and you've got this terrible situation where people are holding information back from each other, which is what you don't want.
I feel like we could go on for like 5 hours on this, but I wanted to ask, some of your work was also kind of post-merger, which, we've talked about organizations that kind of grow organically, but obviously there are situations in which two, small companies or medium-sized companies or organizations get thrown together, whether planned or not planned. We've seen some of that in orthopedics with some of the device manufacturing companies. Mm-hmm. Two of our biggest ones had a merger a couple of years ago, and I think some would argue it didn't go great. And another one had one, and it went really, really well. And sort of some of your work in terms of kind of seeing how the post-merger changes happen, and is it really more the structure, or is it the culture that kind of drives the success of that merger?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing to bear in mind with merger and acquisitions is that most of the time the buyer is losing out on the deal. So the buyer, buying a company reduces value for the organization, about 70-80% of the deals. All of the money really goes to the company that gets acquired, their shareholders. They're the ones that really benefit. So why is it, these companies aren't stupid. They're buying these companies for a reason, and they don't want to lose money. And it comes back down to, a couple of things. The first of which is an over-expectation of the synergies they can realize through the combination. And synergies can be revenue side or cost side. Revenue can be, cross-selling from one company's services to another company's customers. And I'm sure with these medical device companies, it could be a case of, we've got a bunch of customers. We're real experts on, I don't know, the knee joint things, whereas you're an expert on the sort of hips, and we can cross-sell these sorts of devices to each other, or stents, or whatever the device is. Then on the cost side, there's this sort of being able to take out costs, for example, all back office things like IT. The problem is when the deal is actually struck, that generally the buyer overestimates those synergies. It's a human nature. Organizations tend to overestimate their capabilities in being able to get these benefits. So what happens as a result, they don't capture as much value as they initially expected. But then the other big aspect, as you highlighted, is the culture in the two organizations can be very different. And it might be that one organization is very, expect a high degree of autonomy. The managers want a lot of freedom. The other organizations used to more centralized decision making. And then you try and fit one into the other. It's like trying to get a jigsaw piece which is going into the wrong hole. And that can cause a lot of problems. And quite often companies will find, hey, this isn't working, and resell that company at a later stage. So organizational culture, especially, when it comes to, how decisions are made, the degree of autonomy, all these organizational design issues does play a big role.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. As we wind down, maybe we can touch a little further on organizational culture. We have spent a great deal of time talking about our culture, talking about our vision of who we can be as a way to, start the conversation of change, and really being very verbal about what we hope to accomplish and who we hope to be. And some of our structure, our organizational structure, has fallen in line with that. So, for example, we now have vice chairs. Alexander is the vice chair for education, but we have a vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a vice chair for clinical affairs and academic affairs. And, we are prioritizing those efforts and trying to align them with each of our divisions. So any other thoughts that our orthopedic surgeon listeners might take away regarding the relationship between organizational culture and structure and kind of ways to optimize?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to, as you're highlighting there, Charles, is around the sort of alignment between the culture and the, I talked about design to start with, of which structure is one of the three components. You've got to make sure that everything is aligned. So if we think about those three components of design, structure, how decisions are made, and managerial processes, I think it's important that all three of those align. So let me give you an example. The first, if we talk about an open, transparent organization that you're talking about, as you say there, I think with the structure, I think it's really important that, there is some degree of autonomy for individuals to make their decisions without having to consult more senior levels of the organization. So, you're pushing towards there a more sort of decentralized type structure where there's a high degree of autonomy. Secondly, when it comes to decisions, again, beyond just who makes the decision, how you make the decision has to be very transparent. Is it going to be done through some sort of committee by which everybody can see how the decision was made? Are the decision criteria going to be publicly available? That's really important. And then finally, the managerial processes, again, if you want this open transparency, is that they have to be transparent. You were talking about pay, so the human resource aspect is one of these managerial processes, but also how people get rewarded has to be very transparent as well. We've got to know that Alex got promoted because he did X, Y, and Z, and these are the sorts of behaviors we want to reward. People see the right behaviors are consistent with the culture of being rewarded, they will ultimately embrace the culture. But I think part of the problem a lot of organizations face is that maybe those people who get rewarded are inconsistent with the culture an organization wants to engender. I'll give you one example. Everybody's come across Wells Fargo, and their culture, they wanted to have we want this sort of like great sort of ethical organization, but all the incentives are about getting people to open more and more accounts, and eventually these accounts became fictitious accounts when what happened to Wells Fargo. So you've got to make sure that you're rewarding the behaviors you want, not just talking about the behaviors you want.
That's I think a great way for us to close. And I think this again, it highlights just a sample of some of the things that you get when you take the dive into the AOA Apex or pursue kind of this business training. A lot of the stuff that kind of adds, I think, really well-formed ideas into the way that we try to go about our organization. So, Dr. Eklund, huge thank you for taking the time this evening to talk about things. Look forward to connecting. We'll be in LA for the final weekend of the Apex in October, so hopefully we can connect then. But thank you very much, and this was an absolutely fantastic episode.
No, I really enjoyed speaking to you. No doubt you'll probably get emails from me in the future as I dig down into these CPT codes in my research. I'll be asking you for the subtleties of the difference between two types of code. So expect some very specific questions in the future.
Of course, we'd be happy to help. And again, love the conversation. And Alexander and I know that our wheels are turning thinking about everything you said and how it fits with our department. And I think all of our listeners are doing the same. So thank you for joining us. It was great to meet you and learn from you.
Cheers.